everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Freedom Hub Working Group. Just want to make sure that you're excited about the episode today and the ones coming up. So you know you can register, so you're getting notifications on all these future ones by going to yourfreedomhub.com/FHWG, which is short for freedomhub.group. All of these are released over the weekend, so any ones you may have missed, you'll be able to go to any of these favored sites that you may like to see them. And just to give you a flavor of what that looks like, let's take a quick peek here. So this is one of the ones that we've got up on BitChute. For those that are familiar with that, there's Brighteon, which this one's the oldest location. So it's got the bulk of these, which we can see we've been an awful lot, and there's some really great ones in here. And then also we're more recently up on YouTube. So we're just adding them as we go at this stage. So I appreciate that you take a look at that. Again, we are being sponsored by Your Freedom Hub. So as you're looking for anything that's kind of disruptive out there, whether it's for your health or your wealth, this is where you're going to want to go to find out about it. And so we really have an exciting episode, as I said, for today. So I'm going to shift this over to my co-host and let Charles give us a good rundown on what's going on here today.
Sure, Jeff, and welcome, Daniel. We're excited. We're very excited. Ron Paul has really led the liberty movement for a long time. And personally, when I was a trade association lobbyist back in the 90s, I would love to go by Congressman Ron Paul's office on Capitol Hill as a safe haven from all of the cronyism. And he had some staffer changes over the years, and eventually in the 2000s, I met Daniel McAdams and Norm Singleton and Adam Dick. And Daniel was Congressman Paul's foreign policy guy. And that was a good position for Daniel because before that, back in the 90s, he was a journalist covering some of the formerly communist Eastern European bloc countries out of Hungary. So he can probably tell us a bit more about that. But since Ron's retirement, Daniel has helped him start up this think tank, the Ron Paul Institute. And the topic of today is, some of the thinking among activists that Trump is somewhat less interventionist abroad and at home than his predecessor. But that may not be the case, especially from the very idealistic, pure liberty of Ron Paul and his institute. So Daniel, we're excited to hear what you had to say.
Well, thanks a lot, gentlemen. I really appreciate this opportunity to address all of the great people associated with your organization. And I would say, Charlie, you probably enjoyed coming around the office because we were probably the most rebellious people on Capitol Hill. There was always something happening. We had one of our staff members busted trying to bring weed in. We had another one busted for kicking in the chairman of one of the biggest committees, kicking his Mercedes in. He went against him on the red light. So there was a lot of action, a lot of jokes, and a lot of hard work, though, to be honest, as well. So it was a pretty wild time. And it's kind of funny when you say think tank, because when I hear the word, and this is nothing negative, but I think of something that's the opposite. I think we're more of a do tank, or something like that, because when we started it, the idea was to not be long on policy papers. I've been through the whole academic world, and it's very boring. So we wanted to substitute action. The Dr. Paul's mantra is you got to have fun doing what you're doing and do whatever you want to do. And so that's why we kind of combined a lot of different things. We wanted to do short papers. We wanted to do spicy papers. We wanted to do cheeky things rather than just sit around like some guys at Heritage or even the more serious people inside the Beltway. But we did start in 2013. This is right after Dr. Paul left office. And we really, we started from scratch. We didn't inherit Ron Paul's big organization. We started from zero. And we had a big challenge because we had to manage building an organization from the ground up while the memory of '08 and 12 was fading. So you have these two dissecting lines, and so it's very difficult to manage the excitement of a new movement while an old movement is sort of fading into nice memory. So that was the trick for what we had ahead of us. And but we have a great product, which is peace and prosperity. You can't beat it. and we had the greatest ambassador, which is Ron Paul. So that's a pretty good way to start. I would say, we have a three-pronged approach at the Institute. First is the importance of the written word still, believe it or not, in the days of texts and things. And we do publish, 1,000, 2,000 articles a year, a mixture of original analysis and reporting. And we reprint a lot of important things across the spectrum, beyond the spectrum. And I really, and I edit the page, and I like to, in my mind, I like to think that a person turns to that page in the morning would get a pretty good sense of what's important that day, and not from the mainstream perspective, but how you should really think about things that are happening that day. So we'll print things from Jacob Hornberger, for example. We'll reprint things from Max Blumenthal, who does a great job over at the Gray Zone Project, more toward the left. So it's really the idea of creating a broad coalition. So that's the first tier, the first leg. The second is we do the daily Ron Paul Liberty Report. And that's pretty grueling, to be honest. And we started with 0, and now we're actually working toward 250,000 subscribers to our YouTube channel. We're getting close to that. We've had, 25 or 30 million views of the program. We do it every day. It's generally Dr. Paul and I just kind of chewing on the topics of the day, the big topic, trying to look for an alternative analysis, kind of feed it through the Ron Paul analysis machine. But we have had some big guests. We had Julian Assange. We've had Ed Snowden on the show. We've had Nigel Farage from the UK. We had Oliver Stone, and someday I'll tell the story of when we tried to get Oliver Stone, and we had Oliver Stone. It's one of the very few times I've ever seen Dr. Paul angry. But it was a great interview, but the backstory is pretty amazing. Of course, we had Jacob Hornberger on a few times. We've had Tulsi Gabbard on this week, and that was a really interesting program. So we do try to mix in some guests with the analysis, sort of the breaking news analysis. And then really the third prong is our yearly conferences. And we do at least 2, sometimes 3 conferences a year. We always do a Washington conference. And a lot of people say, why do you want to go to Washington? Even Dr. Paul says, why do we want to go to Washington? No, it's horrible. I can't stand it. But in a way, it's kind of symbolic, I like to think, that we're kind of bringing our message to the belly of the beast. We're bringing the circus to town. We're bringing the rebels to town. And I think it's just kind of a good place to bring the kind of things that we have. And our conferences have been terrific, in my opinion. Of course, I'm biased. But we had a live presentation from Julian Assange before they nailed him and sent him away. And that was very powerful. We had a panel of whistleblowers, which was incredible. Peter Van Buren, Phil Giraldi, and John Kiriakou, and so many others. So we've had some great speakers. We've had Dennis Kucinich as a speaker. On the right, we've had Jimmy Duncan, former congressman. We had Doug McGregor on the conservative side. So it's the idea of you can read, you can watch the program, but it's also important to get people together. I know that's what you guys are all about as well. You've got to get together. You got to spend time together. You got to develop relationships with other people who have a similar perspective, that aren't desperately trying to fit into Team R or Team D, who are open ideologically, who understand the value of ideas. So that's one of the reasons why we do think it's very important. In our conferences, I'm happy to say, we sold out every single conference we've done so far. So there is a lot of interest in it. We've also developed a student seminar so that young people can benefit from graduate school level talks. We've had Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson give a talk there, and others. So it's all about bringing people together. And what do we want to do? We want to fight against the war machine. We want to fight against the U.S. empire. But I think more importantly, we want to fight war propaganda. Because before you can have war, what do you have? Endless propaganda. In the lead up to the Iraq War, years of endless propaganda, starting even before this, but you talk about the second Iraq War, starting with the 1998 Iraq Freedom Act, which laid the groundwork for continuing propaganda and lies. So we really have to challenge the regime change narrative, not just say, well, I accept all of the points that you're making. about bad guy of the week. Oh, he's worse than Hitler. He's a nightmare. He eats babies. But, I really don't think we should bomb him, because it costs a lot of money, and that's not good enough. We have to fight the CIA regime change propaganda. No, that's not true. No, he doesn't have mobile weapons labs. They're not pulling babies from incubators. This is BS. We know it. We've heard this. We've seen this movie before. So I think it's very important to fight the regime change propaganda, fight the narrative. And, we're doing it to this day. We talk about places like Venezuela. It's been a little bit off the radar until Trump decided to invite the bozo Juan Guaido to sit in on his State of the Union address, the guy who's still unknown in his own country and has lost any semblance of even remote semblance of authority there and the ability to claim himself an interim president. Endless propaganda about Venezuela, totally untrue. Does it mean we love Venezuela and we love a socialist system of government? No, but our opinion is if you want to fight socialism, it's probably a better place to start here in the U.S., where we have probably more socialism than most countries. North Korea, the propaganda, struggling against that. Iran, the world sponsor of terror. Not true. Got to fight the propaganda or we're going to fight the wars. And so that's sort of our approach to all these things. And, so what I did is I took Charlie Froman's lead. He said I should make some slides, and I hadn't really made slides since grad school, and I was pretty hesitant. So I thought, you know what, maybe I'll make a couple of slides, see what happens. So I'm going to show you my slides and see what you guys think about them. If I can figure out how to do it, I want to share my slides. And
there they are.
There they are. Yeah, and I start with the name with me and our logo. So this is not a comprehensive view of the topic that I'm supposed to be talking about, which is Trump's foreign policy. But why don't we just slip to it? Is Trump's foreign policy okay? Oh, you can't see the okay, but anyway. So I found a good picture of Trump. There he is. He's pretty proud of himself. Is his foreign policy okay, or is it crap? I should have had that as a second part. So we start with the campaign. We all remember the campaign rhetoric. He brutalized Hillary as a warmonger. And although I will be very honest, I was never attracted to Trump. I'm not a voter, period. So I never had a dog in the race. But when he attacked Hillary as a warmonger, I don't think any of us were disappointed. I think it was great. What's wrong with getting along with Russia? The Russiagate thing didn't start in 2016. It started a long time before that. In fact, I don't think the Cold War was even cold yet. Maybe after Yeltsin had given away the farm to well-connected Russians and their well-connected American friends. But certainly after that, things started heating up. And I know when I was on the Hill with Dr. Paul, we fought things like the Magnitsky Act, which is completely bogus. We fought this sort of coming new Red Scare, even though Russia's no longer red. Doesn't seem like most Americans understand that. But here comes Trump in the midst of this hysteria saying, hey, what's the big deal? What's wrong with getting along with Russia? We should trade with them, be friendly with them. Okay, that sounded great. That sounded pretty good. And who didn't cheer when Trump broke the rule of all rules when he turned to Jeb, and basically said, your brother's a loser. He took us to war based on lies. It was a stupid war. It's a bad war. It was a terrible war. And basically, essentially saying everyone who died in Iraq, fighting in Iraq, died in vain. That was some pretty heady stuff. That was pretty hardcore. And I think it scared the hell out of the establishment. Probably that more than anything set the wheels in motion against him. And then what? He attacked the gravy train of all gravy trains, the pension fund of failed European politicians, NATO. They all go there and get huge salaries, even though they're all completely unpopular at home. People like Jens Stoltenberg, who've done nothing in their lives. So he attacked NATO. NATO's no good. Why are we in it? What's the point? And his earlier attacks on NATO, of course, were even more poignant than his equivocations that came later. But let's just concentrate on the campaign. This all sounded great. Why are we still in Afghanistan? So, yeah, there was a lot to be skeptical about. I certainly was never taken in by it. Dr. Paul was beyond not taken in. He was extremely anti-Trump, even as some of the things he heard he liked, and he found him, to be honest, and I think he said it publicly, so I'm not betraying any trust, psychopathic or sociopathic at least. But nevertheless, let's be honest. These things, nobody else was saying these things. Nobody else before maybe back to Ron Paul was saying things like this. So I can see and I sympathize with a lot of our libertarian friends, maybe even some progressive non-interventionist friends who felt like they wanted to get excited about getting Trump elected. We didn't go that far, but we were happy with the rhetoric. And then, so what does he do? He gets in there and he thinks he's got this mandate, right? After attacking NATO, after attacking the Iraq War, after attacking Afghanistan, 18 years of bread and butter for the military-industrial complex. He gets in there and he thinks he's going to put in a bunch of generals and he's going to save the day. He has the idea, the ultimate outsider, New York real estate developer and a TV star. He's going to roll into Washington, surround himself with generals, and take on the establishment. Well, that's not the case at all, and we're learning more as the generals who served him speak out, and others speak out about what was going on behind the scenes, that this was not the case, that the generals were loyal to the system. The system, Trump's come and go, presidents come and go, but the system, if you don't challenge it, continues to reward you forever. And these generals have been handsomely rewarded. In fact, to make general, to get anything above colonel, you have to be political. There's no question about that. So he bring on the generals. He bring on people like H.R. McMaster, who some have said is the guy who brought in Lieutenant Colonel Vindman into the White House. What does Vindman say? Here's Vindman's beef. He drafted the talking points for the Trump called to Zelensky. Trump called Zelensky and didn't keep to the script. And so then Zelensky was pissed off because he said, and he said this in his address in the hearing, in the impeachment hearing, well, Trump went against the opinion of the interagency. I mean, that line itself tells you everything you need to know about the deep state. I hate using that term, but for lack of a better term right now, the establishment, how Washington works. It doesn't matter who's the president. The interagency runs things. The interagency, and it is a real physical thing. It's not a fantasy conspiracy. It is a real existing entity. And the interagency had determined that President Obama's regime change in Ukraine, which they believed would deliver Ukraine into the welcoming arms of NATO and the IMF and the Western financiers and the arms merchants and the NGO do-gooders and USAID and everyone who makes their living off of interfering overseas, that this would be, in the words of the then NED, National Endowment for Democracy director, the prize. Ukraine is the prize. So the danger was that Trump didn't really care that much about Ukraine. And in fact, I hate to say this, maybe wouldn't even be able to point it out on a map. And he didn't think it was the holiest of holies to bring Ukraine into the fold. So he was veering off the reservation, veering off the opinion of the interagency, which believed that no matter which president is elected, the foreign policy has got to be chugging along in the same direction. So President Trump wasn't enthused about this. We've read the transcript of the calls. I happen to differ with the Democrats in the House and in the Senate, in that I saw no evidence of a quid pro quo in the way they presented it. And of course, in our program on the Liberty Report this week, we discussed the withholding of security aid to the Palestinians, and we pointed out that that is indeed a quid pro quo, just like Ukraine in that context is a quid pro quo, because all foreign aid is a quid pro quo. You do what helps me, you do what helps what I'm trying to do as president and running foreign policy, and we'll give you some money. So it's all a quid pro quo. So here we have here we have what the generals did for their leader, for their commander in chief. Stabbed him in the back. So we go on to Iran policy, and I'm really just going to cover Iran and Syria, and I'm going to do it in a thumbnail, hopefully. Trump, got to give him credit. He's been very inconsistent in his actions versus his rhetoric. Get out of NATO. Well, NATO's great. You just got to pay up. Or get out of the Middle East. Let's send some troops in. So it's been pretty inconsistent. Unfortunately, the one thing he's been consistent about is his hostility toward Iran, his hostility toward one of the very few things, in our opinion, that Obama did right, which is to put together the P5+1 talks, put together the Iran nuclear agreement, which in a perfect world wouldn't be necessary because Iran has every right to enrich its uranium to a certain level without sanction. But in the interest of peace, in the interest of promoting trade, will reluctantly accept the fact that it was necessary, if even just to wrong foot the neocons, the war hawks, the far right in Israel, for example, that it served a good purpose. Obama gets credit for that and for opening up to Cuba. But Trump has been very consistent, even if he's been very ignorant on the Iran deal. It's terrible, he said. He never really said what was terrible about it. But he was convinced, and even on the campaign trail in June 2016, Iran is on a path to nuclear weapons. Of course, that's demonstrably false, particularly after the deal was finalized and put in place. The inspectors were there on the ground. And in fact, our own CIA, 15 years ago, had determined that Iran had stopped working on nuclear weapons back in 2003, I think it was. So it's false rhetoric, lies, believing people around him, and just a real hostility toward Iran. So in May of 2018, he kept his word and took the U.S. out of the Iran deal. I think he believed his own rhetoric that he had the art of the deal and that he would soon deliver on a silver platter to the United States a better deal, i.e., Iran's religious leaders on their knees, begging to be to be brought into the fold. And of course, this is a problem in foreign policy because you're often in an echo chamber and you start believing your own rhetoric, and you start mirror imaging, or you start comparing. And Iran is a very different kind of regime. There's no question about it. And I think anyone, and we have some people on our board who are very well known Iran scholars. They could have told him it's not going to work out this way. This isn't how it works. But of course, he believed the other people. Get out of the deal, and we'll get you a better deal, and you can celebrate it. Instead, it hasn't worked out that way. In fact, it's worked out far worse for the president. And in fact, we've argued several times on the Liberty Report that President Trump has put himself in a corner with regard to Iran because Iran is ready to go to war. It has nothing to lose at this point. And Trump really doesn't want a war with Iran, despite the rhetoric, despite the people around him who may want a war, because he understands fundamentally, it's particularly in an election year, it's not a big winner if you're going to run as a president who saved the economy, who's kept us out of war, and all of these things. So he doesn't want that. So moving along the timeline, on October of 2019, he declared the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. It was a pretty unprecedented move to declare a legal military component of a foreign government a terrorist organization. And that, a lot of people argue, and I think there's a good case that can be made, that it sets a dangerous precedent. Of course, Iran proceeded to declare the U.S. military a terrorist organization, and so you sort of open Pandora's box when you do this, and it was a dumb move. And we move on to so this set into motion where we are now, and this is coming back to Trump's interventionism and his foolishness. He secretly greenlit the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian head of the Quds force, a highly respected general in Iran, who he was certainly under the influence, Trump was, of the neocons who always say the same thing. Hey, this is going to be a breeze. Hey, they're going to greet us with flowers. They're going to greet us as liberators. What do you mean it's going to take years? This whole thing in Iraq will be over in a month. Cost a couple of bucks. You know, they always say this, and then when it doesn't, they shrug their shoulders. You know, so what? And so he was convinced it's no big deal. As soon as he takes out, and this is Doug Wormser, who we found out recently, I think a piece was in the Atlantic or the New Republic, but all of a sudden this guy's resurrected from the Bush days and has Trump's ear. He's the guy who argued for the Iraq war that Bush said was boneheaded. All of a sudden he's got Trump's ear. I mean, that Trump said was boneheaded. And now he has Trump's ear and he's saying, hey, kill the guy, no biggie. It's going to destroy the regime. It's going to underpin the foundations of the Iranian Islamic Republic. Of course, it did no such thing. All you had to do was watch the funeral with millions of people in the streets, maybe the largest funeral in history, to understand how wrong they were. So he assassinates him on January 3rd, 2020. And along with an Iraqi general in Iraq, while Soleimani was on a diplomatic mission under diplomatic cover. All sorts of international law, Vienna conventions, all broken, US law broken. It's absolutely, without question, an act of war to assassinate a top general of a country that you're not at war with. It's an absolute act of aggressive war. They tried to cover themselves with the lie that he was planning an imminent attack on US forces in the region. As that became a bit dissected by a usually supine press, Secretary of State Pompeo himself admitted, well, it wasn't exactly imminent. And Defense Secretary Esper said, I didn't see anything about it being imminent. So it's completely undermined, and Trump comes back with his usual bluster. Whatever, wasn't imminent. He's a bad guy. He had to go. You know, so this is the pattern of the lies, but it gets us in greater danger rather than bringing us more toward a solution. And so what do we have a couple of days later? Iran retaliates by sending some missiles into a couple of bases, U.S. bases in Iraq. Even though the U.S. was warned via an Iranian warning to Iraq, it caught the U.S. off guard because the U.S. was not able to intercept these missiles. And I think it shocked the hell out of a lot of people in Washington, to the extent where there were yet more lies coming from Washington when Trump said, hey, A-OK, no big deal, no harm, no foul, no one was hurt. Well, we're finding out later that actually more than 100 soldiers and service members had suffered traumatic brain injury from the blasts. That doesn't sound like nothing was accomplished. So this is where I say that it puts Trump himself in a corner, because now Trump is in a situation where it's made clear by the Iranians, because they didn't deny it. They said, this is what we've done. Made it clear, listen, we are prepared not only to fight a war with you, but we can strike you anywhere we want, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. And the missiles were incredibly accurate as well. And so this was a real wake-up call for the president. I don't know whether he's completely woken up, but it's a wake-up call about going back to the beginning about Trump's rhetoric versus the reality of his actions. And I don't think that he's learned the lesson from this brinksmanship with Iran. And here's my next slide. I just wanted to put it in because it was cool. The neocons, loyal to no one. And I think that's the truth. We've kind of already gone over that. But certainly now Bolton, John Bolton, the hero of the Democratic Party, the resistance. It's really very sad, but the neocons have no problem going from left to right, whoever. It doesn't bother them at all. And so if there's something in it for Bolton or anyone like Bolton, they're happy to go along. And the realists, you know, when Bolton was fired, we had some hopes. They probably shouldn't have, but here's a picture of Colonel Doug McGregor, who's a friend of ours and also a friend of Trump, a very strong Trump supporter. Pardon me. Speaking at one of the Ron Paul Institute conferences, this one was on media and war. And this was a terrific speech that the colonel laid out about how Trump can succeed in his foreign policy and keep America safe. And this is coming from a conservative. The colonel was not a non-interventionist. The colonel was not a pacifist. The colonel, led troops in tanks in the first Iraq War, but he's no dummy, and he understands the importance of using American power very judiciously and carefully. And there was some rumors that he was being considered as a replacement for Bolton, and certainly Dr. Paul and I were very supportive of that quietly, probably because it would have killed his chances. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and probably the current national security advisor, and there's like $10 to someone who could name him, is maybe even more dangerous because he doesn't carry any of the baggage of Bolton, who had a huge target on his back, but carries a lot of the ideology of Bolton, and Trump likes him better. He doesn't have a goofy mustache. So I think that's about all it takes for Trump to like the guy. He has a lifetime in the military-industrial complex as an attorney and a lobbyist. So it's the kind of guy that Trump likes. So, I think with the opportunity of a McGregor, we had a chance for an America First foreign policy with Trump. But that wasn't to be. Instead, what we saw, and this is maybe a confirmation of some of the neocon philosophy, but in the absence of Bolton, because there was a lot of stylistic confrontation, disagreement between Bolton and Pompeo, right? They didn't like each other. They were probably both jealous and vying for the attention of the president. But then the absence of a big personality like Bolton, Pompeo, who was a big guy in his own right, basically took over the whole show. As Secretary of State, I would say Secretary of Hate. He's a person who, of course, don't need to say it again, but we will, bragging about stealing, cheating, and lying as his profession as a previous CIA head of the CIA. He didn't move from the CIA to the State Department to diplomacy. He moved the CIA to the State Department and turned it into an arm of regime change. And in fact, you'd often see him out there making announcements when it came to U.S. military and intelligence action instead of Esper, the Secretary of Defense, which is quite remarkable if you think about it. So Pompeo, a person with some pretty abhorrent views, and I'm not one to attack people's religious views, but let's just put it this way. He has a particular view of the end of times, which doesn't have a happy ending for any of the characters involved. And I think it's dangerous when you bring those things. Certainly everyone has the right to believe as they wish. But when you take those things into policy making, it becomes, I think, a very dangerous thing. And I think Pompeo is an extraordinarily dangerous person, probably the top most dangerous person, certainly far beyond Trump in many ways in the administration. So bye-bye the possibility of a realistic foreign policy. And here's a little snapshot about Syria. And this is the second example of how Trump gets sucked in to doing stupid things. And this is why I would actually respond to Charlie's question by saying, yeah, it's a pretty failed foreign policy. It's a pretty failed if you're looking at it as a non-interventionist. But the doom of false flag in Syria is a perfect example. So on April 7th, 2018, you had a reported chemical attack in Douma, Syria, just as the Assad forces were getting ready to liberate the town. The town was still held by Al-Qaeda. It was still held by jihadists. It was their last stand. And just as Assad was about to take it over, we are led to believe that kind of just because he's a bad guy, he decided to just gas the people, gas the hospitals, gas whatever he could, gas the civilians. And he was an absolute monster. So what did Trump do? Well, did he wait for a team to go investigate? What did he do? No. What was it? On the 13th, less than a week later, he said, Assad's going to have a big price to pay for that. So we sent 100 Tomahawk missiles. By the way, at a cost, when you talk about how all of the things that go into launching an operation like that, you don't just push a button. You have to move resources. You have to move satellites. You're talking probably close to $1 billion total. for this little demonstration. He hit Syria without any evidence. They have to this day never provided a shred of evidence that Assad was behind it. And in fact, he didn't wait for Congress, didn't wait for a declaration of war, didn't even consult Congress, just went in on his own, fired a bunch of missiles, blew a bunch of stuff up. And what do we find out? What do we find out now? And it started coming out last year that when the OPCW, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, an arm of the UN, finally did go in, and they sent in a team on the ground, a team of experts on the ground to actually investigate what happened, they came to very different conclusions with the evidence in hand. And there were a number of things that they said pointed to their conclusion that not only did Assad not gas the people of Douma, that no chemical attack at all had taken place. And there's plenty of stuff out there on this if you want to read about it. But certainly the issue of the gas canisters crashing through the roof, they just happened to land on the bed without any dents in them. And clearly, in the Ian Henderson is the expert's name. In his experience, it was not consistent with what was claimed. The injuries in the video made by the White Helmets, by the way, who are funded by the US and UK governments, the video they made, the injuries they were showing, according to the OPCW experts, were not consistent with the chlorine gas attack. So the foaming at the mouth, the shaving cream all over the mouth, that's not what you get when you have a chlorine gas attack. So that was the second problem. And the third, and there were plenty, but the third other very large problem was that, yes, they discovered the presence of chlorine, but the amount that they discovered were parts per billion, like you'd have in your house if you got some bleach in your washroom. So they came back and reported all of this that they had discovered, these scientists on the ground. Before they went, by the way, and this is Jonathan Steele, the British journalist, interviewed one of the whistleblowers from the team. He said they were ushered into a room with unnamed US officials from unnamed US agencies saying, "Here, guys, this is what happened. Assad dropped gas on his people in Douma." Basically, we expect the report to read that when it's done. Well, they got back and they did their final report and they gave it to their bosses, the head of the OPCW, with this evidence that didn't go along with the narrative. So they were surprised. Lo and behold, the final report came out and the conclusion was 180 degrees from what they had found. Oh yes, Assad did it. It was a chlorine attack, and it's all his fault. And so you had people like Ian Henderson and a couple of other whistleblowers, I think they're up to 5 now, who were on the team saying something happened. They changed our report. They flipped the numbers. They flipped the whole thing around. So it turns out what did happen is that when the team that was on the ground there filed the report with all of the evidence, they simply trash canned that report and brought in a new report from a different team who was in Turkey, who had never been in country. So you have this problem of the president shooting from the hip, and you say, well, he didn't get us into war. He hasn't started any new wars. What's your problem? Why are you hassling him? And so that's why we would say, is he hapless, but his heart's in the right place? Maybe. Maybe that's the case. We have a lot of criticism when we do the Liberty Report because we try to find a middle ground where we criticize the president when he does something wrong, but we try to praise him when he does something right or says something right. And either way we go, we're condemned by people. That guy's a scumbag and he's a warmonger. Why you even bother? Well, if there was no hope, then what's the point? So we do hope he does the right thing. We're very skeptical. We're realistic about it, but it does bring some questions to mind, I think, about the larger scheme of things. How much power does the president really have? How much power over the interagency to change foreign policy, even if he really wanted to? And maybe in his heart of hearts he does. Who knows? At least on some things. I don't think I don't think with Iran he's teachable, but maybe he does. Who knows? But when you look at what's come out of the woodwork, when you look at the activities of the CIA, when you look at what John Brennan did, the initial report on Russian interference with 17 intelligence agencies. Oh, but let's check the fine print. Handpicked by John Brennan. The analysts were. So the whole thing is a cook-up. It was set to wrong-foot the president. They wanted to make it impossible for him to change policy. The big one is Russia, of course. The war on terror is old news. There's no big arms sales involved in the war on terror. We've already armed the jihadists, and they've gotten killed. So, the next big thing is, according to the national security strategy of the United States, well, guess what? Russia and China are the enemies again. And the jobs depend on that. And a lot of mansions around Washington depend on that. So you have to keep the war machine going. So Trump's rhetoric was dangerous, even if he didn't mean to follow through. So I think that's why you see so many even second and third tier people in the intelligence community, even in the FBI and elsewhere, who have conspired against him. That doesn't mean Trump's a great guy, because he's not. But it means something even bigger, which is that there's something very wrong with our society when a president, even a president who has some pretty broad constitutional authority when it comes to foreign policy, pardon me, is incapable of changing the course we're on. Without being conspiratorial, it makes you really wonder who runs things and what can we do about it. So thank you very much. I'm going to cough now.
Okay, Dan, I appreciate being able to talk so long. He had a little cold today, as it were, so I appreciate making it so far before it began to attack you there.
Let me get out of my thing and I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, let's go into some questions here a little bit, so that'll be good. So I want to sort of see where we're at on some stuff with everybody. One of the things like you described is, obviously Trump didn't come into this with some long career as a politician. And so he didn't have like this vested interest in the military industrial complex or the status quo like a lot of these other people that ran against him certainly did. Yet somehow he seemed to like fallen into the same old rut like everybody else. So it seems to show that, like you said, the system is far more powerful than these people that are at the facade that all of us see. And realistically, I mean, like they, threw all those people out in the last so many days. I mean, is that a step in the right direction, or what is it going to take for us to be able to get back control of this thing one way or the other?
Well, I think those people should be fired. They should have been fired a long time ago. It really is a custom to have your own national security team. President Obama, to his credit, probably, he fired every single ambassador the day he came into office who was serving the previous president. That's not a bad thing to do, because you want your team there. You want to have your foreign policy message. Trump didn't get that. Maybe he wasn't ambitious enough, but he didn't do that. So he had people in power who hated him. As to your question, is it a step in the right direction? Unfortunately, no, for the simple reason that he's going to draw people from the same cesspool that John Bolton came from. All of the experts in Washington are people that are called experts because they're part of the machine, they're part of the war machine. They think inside the box. So for him to really bring in people that could, and I don't like the term, I'll be honest with you, but I'll use his term, an America first foreign policy, to really do that, it would require such a fundamental change, such a fundamental shift for him. And he doesn't even know where he would start looking. He would need someone next to him, probably someone like Doug McGregor, who could tell him where to start looking. And these aren't people that you and I might think are the greatest people on earth, but they might be a step in the right direction. The realists, who I've got a lot of problems with philosophically, I'll be honest with you, but they are a step toward the right direction. I don't see that happening. Washington stinks with experts who have never had a success in their entire careers.
What happens as an example if he gets in again, which looks like there's a pretty good likelihood based on what's been happening, is it just going to become infinitely worse as far as like the status quo being able to overwhelm him at that point, or is he something going to be a little less encumbered? And again, he's blundering around, but at least if he kind of throws a couple of clogs into the works, it's good for all of us in the freedom movement mentality. What do you think is going to happen?
It could be. I was thinking back, and I was thinking about doing a paper on this, but comparing Reagan's second term with his first term, and my memory is fading, but it seems to me that Reagan was a lot more fiery in his rhetoric in the first term. The neocons infiltrated his administration in the first term. He created the National Endowment for Democracy in 1983. And if you look at the Reagan in the second term, he was thinking more toward his legacy. He met with Gorbachev, which you can imagine today, you're not even allowed to meet with your enemies. Tulsi Gabbard dared to go over and talk to Assad, and now she's worse than Hitler. So, I'd like to take a look at how that might happen in second terms. And so I would say there's a possibility. But again, I don't see any curiosity on his part. I don't see him thinking that there's a problem with how things are going. So that kind of tempers my enthusiasm for a better Trump second term. I hope he doesn't lead us to war. I don't think his Middle East policy of let's take the oil, let's leave our troops, and let's give Netanyahu anything he wants is good for us. It's not good for the people in the Middle East, including Israel. It's not a smart policy. So I hope that there is a change, but it's hard to be too optimistic.
It's definitely a little two sides of one coin there, because he definitely has that business mentality, but when it comes to the foreign policy side, he's looking at it like it's a business operational deal-making mentality. So it's the stuff you described. That's the way he's trying to maneuver. Let's get the oil. That's an asset. Let's do this, that type of thing. So unfortunately, he's in there as a person who's well-intentioned in many respects, but just only knows what he knows. So there you go. And again, that's perfect fodder for the powers that be to figure out here's how we sweet talk this guy.
Yeah.
And then he'll just go whichever way you dictate. And so he's been good on one side, but mediocre on the other, because he doesn't know what to do on that side. So he listens to like you said, the experts. So there you go. Charles, I see you got your hand up.
Thanks, Jeff. Daniel, you raised an interesting criticism of our State Department guy, Pompeo, given his religion and his end of times dogma that influences position. There's also, you could also raise religion in international criticism, especially when it comes to your America First policy that goes way back. And do you get into the international financial influence that kind of competes with the America First position at all?
What you mean in terms? You mean in terms of his? You mean in terms of his protectionism, or
protectionism, or just the influence of international finance and what our policy is in this country? The opposite of America First, the opposite of populism is globalism, and there's a lot of people on the right, or even some on the left, that are wary about international financial influence on the policies in sovereign countries. Do you get into that policy much ever?
Yeah, I think there is a concern with that. I think there's also a backlash, which I find equally dangerous, and that is the national conservatism, which is a new thing coming up. Which to be honest, I find some sniffs of fascism in it. I don't like a lot of what I'm hearing, but it's a backlash against the globalists, and I think both sides are dangerous. But we certainly have had the rule of the IMF, the rule of the UN. And I think the U.S. likes it when we can control it. We love using that as an extension of power. But, the America First, foreign economic policy is not necessarily that great either. It stinks of protectionism, which is the enemy of liberty, which is a tax on the American people. To answer your question, maybe there is a backlash, and I like the fact that Trump is he's not in love with the international organizations like the IMF, like Obama was. But, following through with it, his follow through, let's put it this way, it leaves a lot to be desired.
That's exactly been the challenge of somebody that's a little, heart in the right place, but really doesn't know what they're doing. So, we luck up by the things that work out and the things that fail. It's like, well, what'd you expect? The person didn't really know what the hell they were doing. And everybody around them is totally vested interest is the opposite direction. It's really a shame. But again, like I've always told everybody, it's better than what that alternative was going to be. As bad as it is, it's better than what the alternative was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, people would say that Hillary would have gotten us into a war, and that's very possible.
So you got to put a positive spin on it, because at least it's one sort of a little opportunity to crack that barn door to let something better start to occur. Because the more we keep them distracted or at bay, the better it is for all of us that suddenly come up with a solution. David, I see you've got your hand up.
Daniel, I guess what I'm hearing is a lot of doom and gloom about the potential for solving things in the public sector, in the political process. And the choice between the lesser of two evils is consistent with that. That being the case, do we need to look outside the public sector for solutions?
Absolutely, and I think we can do that. I think what's something I didn't mention in the talk, which I think is important, is the role of the mainstream media in bolstering. I mean, it's worse. I would say it's akin to the Soviet Union. It's bolstering Washington's foreign policy unquestioningly, and so that's where we can turn to non-public sector. I mean, I consider the media really an arm of the state, and we do have the rise of alternative media. We have everyone is doing their own program, and it's getting a lot more attention. Nobody watches TV news anymore. Nobody watches CNN anymore. People are looking to other sources, and so as long as we can continue to do that, there certainly is an alternative. But ultimately, and this is what all of us libertarians strive for, ultimately is to lower the stakes, to make government irrelevant, so that there is more room for the private sector, and it doesn't really matter. Now, Dr. Paul always talks about Switzerland, how hardly anyone even knows the name of the president. The role is so unimportant. The role of the state. Switzerland has gone in the wrong direction these last few years, but nevertheless, they're still miles better than many other countries in terms of the government just being irrelevant, and that's what I think what we should strive for.
Excellent.
That's great.
Anything else in the private sector that you would look to, besides the very important notion of alternative media?
Well, trade is, prevents wars. Trade, builds relationships, and we saw the blossoming of that with the Iran deal. We saw the Germans and French going in and making deals with Iran. The Iran is starving for so many things, for technology, and unfortunately, our government is still able to control worldwide finance to the degree that it put on secondary sanctions and scared the hell out of everyone, so nobody wants to trade. But private sector trade, civil aviation in places like Iran, can you imagine? Can you imagine when this ridiculous Korean War is finally over, the demand for the private sector in North Korea that could be filled by American companies in partnership with South Korean companies? You talk about, everyone says, oh yeah, war, the national security state is great for the economy. No, it's not. The free market is what's great for the economy, and it goes to, the broken window fallacy and so many other things. Instead of what? Oh yeah, we're building a bunch of tanks. Instead of what? We could be doing so much better. And that's why it really breaks my heart to see I've got a son studying engineering at Texas A&M, and it breaks my heart when I hear the stories about the smartest kids, all the brightest ones, are being sucked up by the military-industrial complex. That's where all the money is. That's where all the sexy jobs are. And you think about what kinds of things, what kinds of technology would we have if it wasn't all going to destructive means. The private sector can deliver such amazing things, but that's why we have to smash the national security state.
Thank you.
Jeff, I have a question. Daniel, any influence on Ron's son Rand in terms of keeping a connection to Capitol Hill?
You mean the relationship between the two of them, or?
Well, more or less, anyone in your circle, the Ron Paul circle with the Rand Paul circle.
Well, I mean, they're very different people, and we watch what he's played a very interesting political game. The senator has, he keeps one foot close to Trump, and they have a personal relationship, and I think Trump respects him from what I hear. But he also, I think, in some ways, I think he's honed his principles on the libertarian side even better. I think he's getting better, and I think he plays. Yeah, he's very different. He plays the political game in Washington like Ron Paul never did. He's pretty good at it too, though. So there's something to be said for that. So I think he's actually, he's certainly, there's no question the best member of the U.S. Senate, followed closely by probably Mike Lee. So I think but he's playing a difficult. It's very difficult to stay friendly with Trump, but really to oppose a lot of things. Probably my guess is that he does.
And unless someone else has a question, what about the flack you've gotten from coalescing with progressives? I saw Tulsi's interview, and you and Ron made that good point that it's not about working with just people that agree with you, but coalescing with folks that don't agree with you, but coalescing on just those things where you agree. I saw some flack you got, but that's pretty magnanimous of you guys to have these broad coalitions.
Yeah, it's the only way. I mean, fighting war is our main thing. And as Rothbard said, I've become more and more convinced that war and peace are the key to this whole libertarian enterprise. And I think that is the case because we talk about the Fed. Well, it's war that gives the Fed its power to print money and control. So there are plenty of things about the progressives that if we spend like literally 15 seconds looking at, we would be very disheartened. However, if we can come together and agree on this very narrow area of war and peace, and I think it will scare the hell out of the people there. And the last thing they want is a left-right libertarian coalition against war. And we're seeing some of that among veterans. There are a couple of new veterans groups that are explicitly conservative, saying bring the troops home. And that is terrifying. And that's why you have sectarians on both sides. And don't get me wrong, the progressive side has a lot of very hardcore sectarians that have conniption fits over, oh my God, you're working with Ron Paul. Don't you know he's a fascist? And so it's not only our side that has people that can't even fathom the idea of working with people that you might disagree with. But we've worked for years with Dennis Kucinich. He's on our board. He's a great guy. There's some things we disagree with him about, but the fundamental thing about whether we're going to get a few million people killed in a war, well, that's kind of important.
Very good. Well, I wish we had more time, Daniel, but I really want to thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all.
Jeff, maybe invite Daniel to talk about his next conference and how folks can follow his work a bit more closely.
Oh, we can definitely squeeze that in. Why don't you?
Sure. Well, our next one is going to be on May 23rd in Houston. We're going to talk about the war on speech. And it's going to be a good one. It's a smaller one than our Washington one, but it's always a lot of fun. Just keep an eye on the Ron Paul Liberty Report. You can find us on YouTube or ronpaulinstitute.org. We'll definitely, within the next couple of days, put up a link with more details. May 23rd in Houston.
Any speakers so far?
Well, we've got our crew. We're going to bring Jeff Deist over from the Mises Institute to talk a little bit about it. And we've got a few unconfirmed people, so I can't really say right now. But it's a half-day conference, and it's going to be, 5 or 6 speakers, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, very good, and thanks again for being here today.